Welcome, everybody, to What the Woman. I am your host, Christine Gasberry. I am a national health editor and best-selling author for women. Today, I'm so excited to welcome one of my beloved former professors. Paul Levinson is the former chair of the communications department at Fordham University in New York City. Dr. Paul Levinson, PhD, is a professor at Fordham University. His science fiction novels include The Silk Code, which was the winner of the Locus Award for Best First Science Fiction Novel of 1999. I remember that. That's around the time I was in your classroom. The Consciousness Plague, The Pixel Eye, Borrowed Tides, The Plot to Save Socrates. That was definitely happening when I was learning from you. Unburning Alexandria, Chronica, and It's Real Life. His novelette, The Chronology Protection Case, was made into a short film and is on Amazon Prime Video. His alternate history short story about the Beatles, It's Real Life, was made into a radio play, won the Mary Shelley Award for Outstanding Fiction, and was expanded into a novel, It's Real Life, an alternate history of the Beatles, published in 2024. That's so cool. He was president of the Science Fiction Writers of America from 1998 to 2001. His nonfiction books, including The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, and New Media, have been translated into 15 languages. Dr. Levinson has appeared on CBS, CNN, MSNBC, the History Channel, and NPR. Those are just a few. That's humble because you've been quoted very, very widely. Your 1972 album, Twice Upon a Rhyme, was reissued in Japan and Korea in 2008. That's wild. And in the UK in 2010. Your first new album since 1972, Welcome Up, Songs of Space and Time, was released by Old Bear Records and Light in the Attic Records in 2020. What a career.
Well, listen, thank you. And everyone who's watching this or listening, you can tell why Christy is one of my all-time favorite.
I made you say that. That's so funny. You're so sweet.
Listen, you really were a great student, and
Thank you.
so proud of everything you've accomplished.
Oh my gosh.
And you're a best-selling author, and you do all kinds of spectacular things. So I'm
Thank
really
you.
delighted to be on this podcast.
Oh my gosh. I need to hear from you so much at this point in our time. And this podcast is a really nice opportunity for me to start to really in depth reconnect with people who have been so important to my own professional development, my worldview. So I'm grateful for the chance for us to talk together. I said to you recently on LinkedIn, I was like, we need a podcast from you. I just need to I feel like I need to talk to you every single day, like the way that I need to hear from Rachel Maddow or the way that I need to, be tuning into NPR. It's just, we need the perspective of scholars and thought leaders like you. The times that we're in right now and this political space that we're in, it's kind of shocking to me. And I don't know how you feel when you hear folks out there, like when I don't want to sound uppity, but when lay people talk about the media or they start using the lexicon, some of the jargon that we use in the field, and I'm like, no. There are those of us who study this stuff, who have dedicated our careers to this field. And I guess, the question I want to start out with you, and I don't know if anybody else can hear, I'm so sorry. Of course, the lawn guys are working outside today. I hope it's not a disturbance, but could I ask first, what does or doesn't surprise you most about the state of U.S. politics right now?
Well, look, you have to have humor in these grim times that we're in. And, I grew up in a time even before Richard Nixon became president, where historians were saying how good it was that FDR came along because Herbert Hoover, his predecessor, was doing nothing to help the United States get out of the Great Recession. I mean, Herbert Hoover is deserves the Nobel Prize when there's one who Republican to what's going on in Washington today. And even Richard Nixon, who I actually was alive and even teaching when Nixon was doing some of the mischief. And it was actually criminal activities, putting up people to break into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. But Nixon was not a fascist. He had authoritarian tendencies, but by and large, he respected the Constitution. When a group of Republican senators went to see him in the early 1970s, as the Watergate scandal was getting worse and worse, and Nixon, look, if you're impeached, we are not going to support you. Nixon resigned. And if you think about that, in contrast to what Trump has been doing, that was a very noble gesture. Nixon was wrong. I disagreed with almost all his policies. He extended the war in Vietnam, spread it to Cambodia. He did all kinds of bad things. But he was not a fascist. He was not right now a democracy. And so I'm very worried. And as I've been telling my students, when you hear someone say, you know what, I may run for a third term, even though there's a constitutional amendment that says you can't do that. If you want to do that, then repeal the amendment. That's the legal way to do it. Go on a campaign to repeal the amendment. That'll never happen because it takes a majority of states to ratify the amendment and so on. Or when you hear Trump say, I may not follow what the Supreme Court decides, that's basically overthrowing our democracy. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. I appreciate that perspective. I remember just a few weeks ago seeing George Conway speak on MSNBC, and he's like, there is a loophole. There is absolutely, he could run as vice president, and then on January 21st, the president steps down for whatever reason. So, what wild, wild times that we're in. I remember in your classroom, I came to Fordham in 2003. And so we were having conversations back then in your classroom and others about the decentralization of media. And I was just at a wedding in DC with my husband and some of his friends who they don't work in our field. They happen to work in medicine. Somebody asked me like, how did we get here? And we were also talking about my book launch and how different it is in 2025 compared to when my first memoir came out in 2011. I said, guys, Instagram, I don't even think it existed yet, or not many of us were on it back then. So can you kind of just, I think it's going to help people have a better understanding. If you were to frame, like, my publisher was talking about how if you get an interview on the Today Show, it doesn't necessarily make a book a bestseller anymore, And we have moved away from, those main television networks. Can you talk about that from your scholarly perspective?
yeah. But first, let me just point out,
Sure.
all due respect to George Conway, I think he's
Yeah.
wrong. And,
Okay.
in
Good. I
2016,
hope he's wrong. I like him, but I hope he's wrong.
yeah, we'll be some. But in 2016, when Hillary Clinton was putting together a campaign,
Yeah.
there was talk about maybe Bill Clinton would run as her vice president, which technically he could have run, but he would not have been able to succeed her as president because it's still a third term as
Got
president.
it.
And it's
This is why we need to hear from you. I think you as a communication, you have a stronger understanding of the Constitution than I think a lot of, really, I think it always surprises me. That's an area, I don't know if you would call it one of your areas of expertise, but First Amendment free speech, you of anybody can speak, way more intelligently to that than anybody I know.
Well, thank you. My father was an attorney, so he had a great respect for the First Amendment too, and I
Yeah.
picked a lot of that up from him. In fact, there was a time in my life when I was thinking about becoming a lawyer, or should I go on for a PhD, and I can't even remember why I decided. It was probably my laziness. I didn't want to go to law school and have to memorize all these things that lawyers
Yeah.
do. But anyway, let me answer your question. Yes, the media landscape has drastically changed. And for a long, long time, really since the birth of newspapers, and
Mm-hmm.
that then continued with the advent of radio, and in turn with the advent of television, plus network television, and then cable television, we
Mm-hmm.
lived in a very centralized media system where if you wanted to get information, you had to consult some mass medium that you had no control on. And actually, if people had read Marshall McLuhan's work back in the 1960s when he talked about the global village, if you think about it, a village is a two-way street. People not only receive information, but they distribute information.
Yeah.
And the growth of social media has just overturned all of that. And it doesn't matter whether it's Instagram, TikTok, X, which used to be Twitter, YouTube, they all have the same characteristics, which on the one hand are very liberating. They're very liberating because you can do a podcast, I can do a podcast,
Yeah.
anybody can do a podcast. That's very democratizing. But it's also dangerous because
Yeah.
it means there's no check really on people who are just lying and spreading dangerous disinformation.
I've been hearing on social media, even just this past weekend, there are a few people I follow. One, her name is Civic Sage, and she's like me. She's like my age. She's exhausted and infuriated, and she was remembering this interview between Ted Koppel and one of the figures from Fox News. And the Fox News guy said to Koppel, "You don't actually think Fox News is like real serious news?" And Koppel goes, "Yes, I absolutely do." And so I was like, "What?" Then I start researching, like, why isn't the FCC regulating? And you probably already know this. I was like, "Oh, this is why," because they only regulate what's on the freely distributed networks, not what is on, paid subscription cable news. So I remember the days when I was, growing up in small town Pennsylvania. And I remember when my grandpa, who was the child of Italian immigrants, who didn't graduate from high school because he was drafted to go serve in World War II, helped. We didn't know this. I didn't learn this until a couple of years before his death, or a few years before his death, I guess, but he had driven up some of the tanks that helped to liberate, the camps at the end of the war, and we found, I think right when he passed, we found an old Nazi armband that he had kept. So I would have loved to have learned, that generation was pretty private about what they went through. And then he used the engineering training that he had learned serving in the war and started our family's manufacturing business, where all the guys still work today. But I remember being a kid and hearing him start to talk about Rush Limbaugh. And if I remember correctly, we lost him in 2008. I can't speak for him, but I think he was pretty jazzed about about some of Limbaugh's messaging. And that, I mean, I don't know your perspective, but I think of that as a turning point in our consciousness. And that's when we started to see this like snowball effect where a network like Fox News is gaining such popularity and becoming such a part of the mainstream.
All right. Well, a couple of things. First of
Yeah.
all, as you may recall, I think the FCC from its onset in 1934 in the Federal Communications Act was and is blatantly unconstitutional.
Amazing.
It
Please
violates,
speak to that.
yeah, well, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or the press. So, what goes on television and radio back then basically
Yeah.
is people talking, and it is also reporting and offering opinions, which is what the press is. So, although I greatly admire Franklin Delano Roosevelt for getting us out of the Great Depression,
Hmm.
for winning World War II as being the leading nation against the Nazis and Japan and Italy. And I think he's probably our greatest president. He wasn't a perfect president. And
Hmm.
his creation of the FCC and his pushing that through Congress, and then the Supreme Court in 1944 ratified the FCC. They said because people have no control when they turn on the radio, who knows what they're going to hear.
Hmm.
We as the government need to regulate it. But that I think is a very, very dangerous thing. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to see the FCC regulate anything, even reprehensible networks like Fox News.
Interesting.
But there is a way of regulating them. And believe it or not, I wrote a letter to another federal agency, the FTC, the
The
Federal
Federal Trade
Commission,
Commission.
right?
Hmm.
And its mandate, its job is to, or one of its jobs is to prevent false advertising. Because if you say, hey, come to this wonderful, delicious Italian restaurant, and you show up at the Italian restaurant, and all they have is old fashioned, boring American food, yeah, then basically there's something wrong with that kind of advertising. It's taking
Hmm.
off the people, and the FTC would investigate that. So I
Hmm.
wrote a letter saying I
Good for
thought
you.
misleading for Fox News to even have the name Fox News.
I hoped that's where you were going with
Yeah,
this.
yes, they should rename themselves Fox Propaganda. That's what it is. It's a propaganda outlet. It doesn't respect the truth. There are a few people on there who have some respect for facts. Shepard Smith, who's no longer on Fox News,
Right.
he was one of the few who did that. Brit Hume, when he was there, was pretty good. There's still a few people here and there, but by and large, you have these people who come on who just mouth a lot of this MAGA nonsense, and worse than nonsense. So
Yeah.
I wrote that letter to the FTC. I put it on my Fordham University letterhead. What do you think happened? I got no response. So unfortunately, I don't know. Maybe they didn't get the letter. Maybe they thought I was joking. But that, I think, is the only way we can control Fox News. But here's what I also think. And as
Yeah.
far as Rush Limbaugh is concerned and Fox
Yep.
News, it, I think it's not cor- correct or accurate to think that there were people out there who basically had no opinion, or maybe they had a more ecumenical opinion, maybe a
Hmm.
tolerant opinion, and then they turned on Fox News, or when Rush Limbaugh was alive, turned on
Hmm.
radio station was.
Yeah.
That sort of converted them to become MAGA fascists. I think the deeper truth, which is in many ways even more frightening, and it's hard to accept that this is true, that there are many Americans who before Rush Limbaugh, before Fox News, felt that way. They had grievances. They That's why they were so hostile to anyone who had a different ethnicity from them.
Yep.
They were hostile to immigrants because these Americans felt they weren't getting the jobs that they deserved, and they
Mm-hmm.
deeply resented anyone who wasn't a white man getting that job. So they were
Mm-hmm.
hostile to women. They were hostile to African Americans. They were hostile to immigrants who came from anywhere because they felt those people were robbing them of their due position in society. And sadly, if you look back at Nazi Germany and its origins in the Weimar Republic in the 1930s, that's exactly what Hitler
Yeah.
relied on and led to Hitler's rise in power. And it's important to never forget that the Nazis were twice elected, not to a majority in the Reichstag, but to in a very commanding position where they were able to combine with a couple of other small parties and have a majority. And then Hitler got tired of elections and said, we're not going through this again. It's a waste of time. I'm the Führer. And that was the end of the Weimar Republic. So to make a long story short,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think we have to recognize that there are people. Look, I live in New York State, and I'll never forget. I took my daughter Molly
Yep.
to a media ecology conference up in the Catskills.
Awesome.
Yeah, this was like when Hillary Clinton was running for president. I'm sorry, was running for senator in New York. So that's
Interesting.
well, that was. And we're driving back home, and we see a sign that there's like a farm selling apples. Okay. So I drive up in the car and, we get, some apples. And the guy who's selling the apples is like walking around the back of my car because I'm putting like a bushel of apples in the trunk of my car. And I had a Hillary sign on. And I'm there with my daughter. And the guy looks at me, and I'll never forget the look in his eye. He's saying, "You're voting for that woman?" And like it was just like sheer hatred in his eyes. And I've never experienced anything like it. And it was especially frightening to me because I'm there, with my daughter, who's, I don't know, 10 years old at the time.
Wow. Yep.
So, and, since Trump has come along, I see Trump signs up on Cape Cod where we drove for part of the summer.
Yes.
I see Trump signs in Westchester County. Look, I mean, I think the tragedy is that Trump did win the 2024 election. That more Americans, forget about the electoral college, even just look,
I'm with you.
a majority of Americans voted for him. Why? Well, I think because they don't want a woman in the White House. They certainly don't want a woman who has any connection to anything other than this white supremacist idea.
Yes.
And this is the country we live in, and the only thing that's protecting us from becoming another Nazi Germany is the Constitution, and is the people in office who still have some respect for that. And we know that we can rely on the Democrats. And what's going to determine the future, I think, of our country is how many Republicans are like Mitt Romney, who unfortunately can't take this anymore. I don't blame him. But if enough Republicans are able to stand up to Trump, with the Democrats will be okay.
I want to, you bring up a point that I'm grateful that I get to talk about it with you. And you may or may not know this about my life, but it has informed so much of my work. And it's having come from a small and I would say conservative hometown in Pennsylvania, very homogenous. We were right in the middle of the state. Our biggest industries are healthcare and manufacturing. our factories and the hospital who fixes you when you get hurt at the factory, and so many people that you associate with there work for those places. And I went to Catholic school. I feel like this is a professional qualification. I wish it were. I went to Catholic school for 20 years. That's not quite accurate. I took a year off between college and grad school to, apply to Fordham, but I was a teacher's assistant at a Catholic Montessori school during that year. So, my life has been very, very informed by the daily practice of my faith. And I'm so grateful that I had grown-ups in my life, and I won't name them because now we really differ politically, but I was pushed to go to John Carroll undergrad and felt, coming from my Catholic high school, I felt a little bit like a country bumpkin. Like I didn't feel like I was going to fit in with the very polished, we called, JCU, we called it J Crew U. But I'm so grateful that I went on to graduate from 2 Jesuit universities. And here you and I are talking on the day that, our revered Pope has just died. And what's also really interesting was always interesting to me about your position at Fordham, when I was studying communications at what is now the Tim Russert School of Communications at John Carroll in Cleveland. And Luke Russert just blurbed my book that's coming out a week from tomorrow. But the chair of the communications department was an Irish Catholic nun, and then I come to Fordham and it's like only at the New York City Jesuit University could you have a Jewish leader of the communications department. But I got to tell you, I think what I love most about my education is I've just gotten to learn from people from so many different perspectives. And of course, the stepping stone that was Cleveland, to start to expose me to more culture, and then to come to New York and to start to work on, I ghost wrote, I think my husband and I were always like, how many books have I written? I think I ghost wrote 5 books, and one was with a couple whose child was deaf and transgender, and another was with a woman who was incarcerated for 27 years for the role she played in a very high profile New York City murder in the 80s. So I just, I guess you all, but I think especially the Jesuits just taught me love so well. When we talk about, we learned in grade school, I think, that the word Catholic means universal because Jesus loved everyone, and I kind of, it's remarkable to me that piece, I don't know whether you can speak to this, and then that's going to segue me into this other, I think I mentioned the one very specific and very controversial topic I'm hoping that, that you can shed light on. But wow, it's sad to me that there are people, even in my hometown, who I've been very, very vocal on social media. And to the point where after all of these months, my mom has said to me twice, people are asking me if you're okay, and I'm like,
Oh,
are any of us okay? Really, if you're okay with what's going on right now,
that's full.
none of us, as a national health editor, the rates of depression and anxiety and stress that that have skyrocketed since 2015, that's not a coincidence. There's a really big societal factor at play there. But just the chance that there are still, it was so shocking to me in the past few years to see just how many people But it's remarkable to hear from you too that are even in these around New York City, people like they just can't embrace people who are different from them, you know?
Yeah. Well, again, yeah, that, what I was saying, it's incredibly upsetting to realize that maybe not your next door neighbor because you know your next door neighbor pretty well, but probably if I took like a 5 or 10 minute walk, as I often do around my neighborhood,
Yeah.
in some of those houses, I've seen pumpkin signs. So that's how bad it is.
Yeah.
I will say a couple of things about Fordham and the Jesuits. First of all, the Jesuits have a great tradition. The Berrigan brothers during the Vietnam War, another unconstitutional activity, by the way, is not a declared war. It blatantly violated the Constitution, and many people died as a result
Wow.
of that war. And they
Yes.
fought that war. They're among the leaders of that war. And the Jesuits have played an enormously important role in the world and at Fordham University. And
Mhm.
as you know, the raison d'etre of the Jesuit order is to go out there in the world and interact with people and try to
Yeah.
add to that world. And I'll just tell you one of my favorite true stories about the previous president of Fordham, Joe McShane, who actually
Mhm.
was Jesuit, but obviously devout Roman Catholic.
Mhm.
And actually, maybe he was a Jesuit, come to think of it. I think our current president is not a Jesuit.
Okay.
She's actually comes from a family of Jesuits. But Joe McShane was a Jesuit. Anyway, to
Okay.
give you an example of how he thought, I'm not sure if you were still here or this might have been slightly before you. I'm not 100% sure, but I was already chair of the department. And there was a meeting that was called by the graduate dean of chairs, of all the chairs of the department, because the president of the university, Joe McShane, was coming to speak to us. Okay.
Okay.
So the meeting was like set up for like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay. That morning, I get a call from CNN saying, could you come down here? They didn't have Zoom in those days. We want to interview you about whatever topic.
Mhm.
And I said, well, what time is it? What time's the interview? And he said, well, yeah, we're going to have you on like at 12 noon. I said, well, how long is that going to be? And he said, not more than 10 minutes. And the meeting yeah, of the graduate group of faculty with Joel McShane was going to take
Mhm.
Lincoln Center. And in those days, CNN was like just a few blocks away from
Yes,
Lincoln.
it was. Yep.
So I said, okay, I'll do it. All right. So I go down there. I'm there. It's 12 noon, sitting. It's 5 after 12. It's 10 after 12, the quarter after.
Mhm.
And I finally say to like the producer, look, I have a pretty important meeting up the block at Fordham. He says, don't worry, just another minute or two. I promise some other news story is breaking. We'll have you on. To make a long story short, they didn't get me on the show until about 10 minutes to one. The meeting was
Oh, yeah.
one. Then they proceeded to talk to me for about 15, 20 minutes, which is
Mhm.
a good thing. It's a lot of airtime,
That's a long time. Yeah.
but I'm late for the meeting. So I go
Yeah.
running up the street, get into the room. There is Father McShane, and there is the whole council, including the graduate dean. I walk in there, it's 20 minutes after one. The graduate dean looks at me and says, well, nice of you to show up, Paul. I guess you didn't care that the president of our university was going to be here talking to us. McShane, with this twinkle in his eye, looks at me and the whole group and says, I heard that Paul Levinson was on CNN. I just got a call from our publicity director right before I came to this meeting, and he's talking on CNN or was talking about whatever it was. I think
Yes,
that
sir.
publicity for the university. Paul, you did the right thing. Good for you to go on CNN. It brings
Yeah.
much more value than you coming here just to hear me talk. The only path forward is for all people who can see this danger to do whatever they can from their own positions, whether they're influential positions, not influential positions, whatever. Everyone has a role to play in this. And I'm very glad you're doing this podcast for that reason, in addition to being so great to be able to have this conversation with you again, because there are an infinite number of ways of getting word out about the current state of our country and therefore our world, and everyone needs to speak up in whatever way they can.
Thank you for that. And I think of you so often because I remember, I'm sure you remember how committed I was to writing books. I was so single-minded about it. And, I didn't meet my husband till I was 38 because I always had my head in the laptop, and I'm sure that doesn't surprise you, but you said to me back then, I just want you to know it's a solitary pursuit. And and you knew because you had written a ton by that point and you'd published a ton. And I'm glad that you highlighted that point for me because I probably would have thought something was wrong with me. Like that's just the reality of what we do when we're writing. But you make a good point. I mean, this month I celebrated, it's been 21 years since I took my first full-time job at Simon and Schuster, and I wanted to reverse engineer how do you get a book published, and how do you, and I had such great teachers, great managers and leaders there, and learned a lot, but the work has become too solitary. So this podcast, it really is, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, women from my hometown or around that region, I think some have kind of looked to my path and sought some guidance. It's informed some of their own choices, but not only I'm like, it's time to break out of this very solo pursuit and start to have these connections. So thank you. I mean, you're only my second guest, so I want to ask you one more question. I think I mentioned when I reached out to you in my first note, I want to have this conversation as we're talking about faith, as we're talking about Catholicism and Christianity and our work around and with the Jesuits. What's been so interesting to me, we hear about the single issue voters, and I realize, I mean, it really, really crystallized for me this last election. I come from a community of single issue voters, and in my hometown, I mean, every year it was, I don't know, I don't want to overstate, I don't want to misspeak, but I think we were required to march in the annual pro-life rally through town, and during pro-life week. And fortunately, I feel like in my own case, when you go to a Catholic school and you're taking religion and theology every day, and then when I love the foundation that the Jesuits made us get, taking at least a year of philosophy undergrad is what I had to do. But somehow it got through to me that pro-life is not only anti-abortion, and and still, with my upbringing, and I'll still say today, I mean, I'll share with you, and I know that I can share this with you. In the past 2.5 years, I've lost 2 pregnancies, and so thank you. And thank God it's 2025 and there is science and medicine until they take it away from us. But, crazy that we have to even think these things. So we're working through it, but something that surfaced for me in my understanding from this past election, there were two things. One, I was writing a lot of postcards and doing a lot of phone banking back to Pennsylvania from where we're living now in California. And one of the volunteers, like one of the fellow volunteers I was phone banking with the one night, he's like, when you get a Catholic on the phone, make sure you tell them that the church actually, there is doctrine within the church that they allow for medical intervention when the mother's life is in danger. And I'm like, how has that messaging gotten so lost? And something else that I've heard recently, and I need now that, the book is going to be out soon and I'll be able to research this a little bit more, but I heard, and I'm wondering if you have any historical context to bring this about, I heard that the right in politics didn't start to focus on abortion as an issue to target voters rhetorically until desegregation happened. Like, and the way that the person who explained it, when I heard it, they were like, they always have to oppress somebody, And so can you speak to any of that? Like, if you're a single issue voter and you think you're being this is not pro-life,
No, I agree with you. But first, let me just say, first, I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, about what.
Thank you.
I,
Thank you.
I, I
Thank
also
you.
just want to say, I think you're going to make a wonderful mother.
Thank you.
Your sensitivity and intelligence, your children will be lucky to have you.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you.
You know, it's- and your children, just like you, and I'm sure your husband, are going to contribute something to this world in a memorable way. I'm sure.
Thanks.
On the abortion issue, I have a couple of things to say. First of
Mm-hmm.
all, this might sound a little strange. The overthrow of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs
Mm-hmm.
decision is really a blatant violation also of the First Amendment, which also talks about separation of church and state. In other words,
Interesting.
to keep its hands off religion and vice versa. And the reason why I'm saying that is in the Jewish religion and in the Muslim religion, there is no clear proscription that is something you shouldn't ever do against.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much less clear thing if it's there at all. And the question of even when it's okay, I mean, it's never okay. It's a tragedy. But when it's not an unethical, terrible thing for a woman to undergo an abortion in the Jewish religion, different rabbis, different people who follow the Jewish faith,
Yeah.
and that there are different months. And the same is true with the Muslim religion. So, and I think even in some Protestant sects as well. So, this ruling, even though the Roman Catholic Church, I think, not to its credit, is so opposed to abortion, is
Yeah.
the singling out a particular religion or even a group of religions and saying, we don't care what the other religions are saying. It doesn't matter if you follow those other religions. You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if you're a woman, you can't, have an abortion. It's against the law.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to say, that this is a very, very complicated issue. And that's why it's such a profoundly ethically complex problem. Because what it's doing is it's pitting two ethically important guidelines against each other. One guideline is that human beings should have complete say over what goes on inside their bodies, right? I mean, in just about every other thing, we all agree no one should have the right to tell you what you do with your own body. And obviously, there are exceptions to that, like vaccines would protect the public health because they protect other people and so on. But the general principle that women should have control over such a serious aspect of their own lives and bodies. That's a very, very profound and important ethical principle. But there is also the principle about how important life itself is. And the problem is, everyone would agree that, a sperm and an egg are not human beings. They have to get together, and what results from that is a human being. Everyone would probably also agree that at the instant of conception, I mean, even at that point, although the sperm and egg are together, the DNA is complete, it's not a human being. It has to develop into a human being. And I think that that is something that we just can't ignore or easily dismiss either. In other words, I'll understand what the anti-abortion people, if that's really what they're trying to do, are saying. I think Okay. So I think that ultimately, though, I mean, it's a very tough decision. Were I on the Supreme Court, I would have given very careful consideration to these cases, but I would have sided with Roe v. Wade because I think because it's so unclear, when, life begins, everyone agrees that obviously once a child is born, and obviously, in the later stages of pregnancy, there's a little human being in there. But at the very beginning, if you talk about what science says, it certainly doesn't nonetheless seem like a human being, like a day or two or three or a week after conception. So it's a very tough decision, but I think the quote was right in what they decided in Roe v. Wade. But I think that you're right also in terms of the people who have jumped on this issue, including Donald Trump, by the way.
Oh, listen, he knew. I mean, we can all agree that killing a baby is
Right.
bad.
That's
And
right.
I think you would agree, he is a master at oversimplifying messaging
Yeah, that's
and
right.
getting in people's brains that way, you know?
Yeah, and look, I'll never forget in the 2016 campaign, he was interviewed by Chris Matthews. I don't know if you saw this on MSNBC, and yeah, Matthews asked him point blank, so, what's your position on abortion? And he said, well, I'm against abortion, even though he'd previously been okay with it. And Matthews said, well, let me just go a little further. Are you saying that a woman who undergoes an abortion and goes through that trauma, that tragedy, should be? And you can see Trump's mind spinning, well, yeah, I think she should be punished. So, in other words, that's the first time he even thought of that question. And so you know, he has no opinion except to glorify himself, to stay in power as much as possible. And I think the anti-abortion crusade has taken advantage of that. And they got Trump to appoint people who had similar positions. And that's why the country is in the state that it's in now. And I think that ultimately the country probably will go back to something more like Roe v. Wade, but it's going to take a long time. And because one thing about the Supreme Court is obviously people are there for life, and we just have to hope that all of the fully democratically appointed justices have to leave the court while Trump is still in office. If they can hold on for another few years, maybe until the next election, and assuming Trump doesn't seize a third term, then maybe we can begin turning things around for this Supreme Court.
Thank you for that. I feel like I want to say, just for the sake of this conversation, I want, in case it doesn't come up again on this podcast for a while, and I'm grateful to have you as my witness to say it. I mean, that this topic, I feel like of the women, while I personally do not think there's any circumstance under which I could make that choice personally, the women of the friends I know who have had to make that choice, it was done for medical reasons. It was their own life was in danger. In the cases that I know of, both their own life and the child's life was in danger. And when you come from a small town, I feel like you don't usually know people who have actually been in some of these situations. Same as you don't know a single transgender individual, the same as you don't even really know any immigrants, or maybe not even any Jewish people. So it's just I'm thankful for your side of it, for the scholarly impression that you bring to it. This has been a really, really wonderful conversation, and I'm so grateful. Is there anything I have to mention? My own next book, that as you and I are taping this, it's out a week from. It's out a week from. It's out April 29th. I'm not sure exactly when this episode is going to air, but Show Don't Tell: A Writer, Her Teacher, and the Power of Sharing Our Stories. This is about my 30-year friendship with my high school English teacher, who I revere in the way that I revere you. She really opened my mind and encouraged me to leave our small hometown and go see the world and get my education from the toughest university that would take me. And so I'm going to be talking to her after you and I wrap up here, but this has been great. Thank you. Is there anything what are you working on right now? What's happening with you?
Well, first of all, I just want to tell you a couple of things, and I'll tell you what's happening with me. First of
Sure.
all, why don't you come on my podcast sometime in May? We'll talk all about your book. Okay, that's yeah. Uh, that- That's one thing. That's why I just want to make a point about you saying like one track voters, one mind, you only have one. I just want to throw in here, we have no idea why people vote, because the only way we know how they voted and why they voted is because they say this in an interview when someone, a pollster, talks to them. They could be lying, they could be standing with their significant other and don't want the significant other to know who they voted for. So it, in a perfect world, we wouldn't even take polls because they wind up distorting, the electoral process. Even though it's so good to know, we want to get as much information as possible. Okay, I'll tell you, thanks for asking. The main thing that I'm working on right now, in fact, as soon as we this interview, I'm used to talking about books that I wrote, but now I'm going to talk to you about a book that I'll be publishing, which I didn't write. Among the many things that I've been doing over the years is I created a small publishing company, Connected Editions, decades ago. And yes, oh, it's amazing. I'm such a bragger. And I never said anything about this. But so we Connected Editions is publishing a book about Marshall McLuhan. It's called Wisdom Weavers: The Lives and Thought of Harold Innis and Marshall McLuhan. It's written by Tom Cooper. I've known him since the 1970s. He used to work with McLuhan. He's been writing this book since the 1970s. It's almost 700 pages, and I think it is just what we need to help us understand what can we do in these insane times, because Hoover has a keen understanding of McLuhan, and he's very attuned to the current age. So on May 1st, that's when the book is going to be published. And I'll tell you that if we are having actually a launch event, which I interviewed Tom Cooper through Zoom, and I'll send you the URL. It's
Please
going
do.
at 8 p.m. Anybody who's interested in coming to this event by Zoom, obviously it's totally free. Just email me, Levinson, Levinson, at Fordham.edu. And if you ask me in a nice way, I'll be happy to send you the URL.
Awesome. Awesome. That's so exciting. I feel like, I mean, I'm hoping that you'll be available to come back on the show because we need to be talking about McLuhan. Were you his student?
No, I was never actually his student, but
Okay.
I worked
Okay.
with him.
Oh,
And
so you did work with him.
I
Okay.
did,
Yeah.
yes, I wrote a preface to one of his articles, Laws of the Media. I met him in New York. He invited me up to dinner in Toronto. I mean, one of my favorite things is my wife and I are back in our hotel after one of the dinners over McLuhan's house, and David Frost is interviewing Richard Nixon, who's resigned, and it's like about 10 to 11 at night, and the phone rings. And so I said, "Who even knows we're here?" And so I pick up the phone, and there is Marsh McLuhan. "Oh, I hope you're watching David Frost, being interviewed." He's much cooler now than he was in the JFK.
Wow. Wow. That's awesome. Well, I guess we both have books that are coming out next week. So I'm sure you've been working hard on that. Well, congratulations. That's exciting.
Thank you. And I'm going to do my best to promote your book as well.
You're so dear. I appreciate you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I don't know if we sound like geeks, but I could just have a podcast with you talking about the things that we're passionate about. So thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome. And actually, listeners, you'll get another chance when Kristen's on my podcast. That'll be sometime.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Paul Levinson. Take care. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.